Hollywood wasn't always polished, safe, and carefully censored. Before the 1940s, filmmakers pushed limits so far they shocked audiences, terrified studio bosses, and even triggered government crackdowns. These weren't just movies, they were cultural earthquakes. So what happens when the silver screen dares to go further than society is ready for? Get ready, because we're diving into 15 American films that redefined boldness long before Hollywood was playing it safe. Babyface, 1933. If you want to talk about a movie that rattled Hollywood so hard it helped slam the door on creative freedom for decades, you start with Babyface. Starring Barbara Stanwyck in one of her fiercest roles, this 1933 pre-code drama dared to show a woman using her brains and her allure to climb the ranks of New York's business world, and it didn't sugarcoat a thing. Stanwyck plays Lily Powers, a young woman who's had enough of being mistreated in her small town. Tired of being controlled, she listens to the advice of a local philosopher who tells her to use men to get the things you want. She takes that advice literally, heading to the city and starting at the very bottom of a corporate tower. What makes Babyface explosive is how openly it portrays Lily leveraging each rung of the ladder. Office after office, floor after floor, she rises until she's sitting in the executive suite as powerful as the men who once looked down on her. For audiences in 1933, this was dynamite. Women were rarely shown in control, and if they were ambitious, Hollywood usually punished them by the end. Not Lily. She's ambitious, unapologetic, and for a large part of the film, she wins. Even the ending feels like a compromise forced on the filmmakers after censors panicked. The original cut was so daring that it's still shocking to watch today. The movie became one of the reasons Hollywood clamped down with the production code in 1934, essentially locking films into stricter moral rules for decades. That's how much it scared the establishment. What makes Babyface bold isn't just the plot, it's Barbara Stanwyck herself. She plays Lily with steel in her voice and fire in her eyes. She's not a victim, not a side character, but the mastermind of her own story. Nearly a century later, Babyface still feels like a rebellion caught on film, one that proved women could take charge on screen long before Hollywood was ready to admit it. Freaks, 1932. If there's one film that shook audiences to their core in the early 1930s, it's Tod Browning's Freaks. Released in 1932, this movie didn't rely on makeup, masks, or special effects to create its shock value. Instead, Browning cast real circus performers, people with physical differences that mainstream Hollywood usually kept hidden. For the first time, audiences were forced to confront their own prejudices on the big screen. And let's just say they weren't ready. The plot is deceptively simple. A beautiful trapeze artist, Cleopatra, pretends to love one of the sideshow performers, Hans, in order to get his fortune. But her cruelty and deception eventually trigger the carnival community to band together in one of cinema's most chilling finales. That infamous chant, one of us, became burned into movie history. By the time the film reaches its stormy climax, where the freaks crawl through the mud to exact revenge, audiences were reportedly fainting and fleeing theaters. But here's the boldest part. Freaks wasn't mocking or degrading its sideshow cast. Browning, who had once worked in carnivals himself, presented them as fully human, flawed, funny, loving, and dignified. It was the so-called normal characters who were the true monsters, consumed by greed and cruelty. That reversal was daring, and it rattled society's sense of order. MGM thought they were getting another horror hit after Browning's Dracula. Instead, they got a cultural firestorm. The film was banned in the UK for over 30 years and slashed to pieces in America. Critics called it grotesque and tasteless. But over time, Freaks was rediscovered, hailed as a groundbreaking masterpiece of empathy and horror. For 1932, it was far too much for mainstream audiences. Today, it stands as proof that cinema can be both shocking and human at the same time. Freaks wasn't just bold, it was decades ahead of its time. Scarface, 1932. If gangster films had been a warning shot in the early 30s, Scarface was the full-blown machine gun blast. Directed by Howard Hawks and produced by Howard Hughes, this 1932 classic didn't just dabble in violence, it reveled in it. Loosely inspired by Al Capone's reign in Chicago, it gave audiences a look at the underworld that felt dangerously close to reality. Paul Mooney stars as Tony Camonte, a ruthless immigrant who climbs to the top of the mob by mowing down anyone in his way. Hawks filled the movie with Tommy gun shootouts, brutal power struggles, and a chilling sense that crime was as much about ambition as it was about survival. The famous X motif appearing in shadows and decor spelled death for anyone unlucky enough to cross Tony. It was a clever visual cue, but it also sent shivers down spines. Censors hated Scarface. They demanded changes, insisting Hughes and Hawks soften the violence and moral tone. Multiple endings were filmed, including one where Tony faces justice. But Hughes, never one to back down, fought to keep the movie raw and uncompromising. He wanted the public to feel the allure of crime and then recoil at its consequences. What makes Scarface so bold isn't just its body count, it's its honesty. It dared to suggest that gangsters weren't just thugs in alleys, but products of a corrupt society where power and greed ruled everything. That idea rattled both audiences and the authorities. In the years since, Scarface has been recognized as the blueprint for every gangster movie that followed. Without it, you don't get The Godfather, Goodfellas, or even the 1983 remake. In 1932, though, Scarface wasn't just a movie. It was a cinematic gunshot that echoed across Hollywood. Tarzan and His Mate, 1934. Hollywood's jungle adventures were usually safe family fare, but Tarzan and His Mate swung straight into controversy. Released in 1934, this second entry in the Johnny Weissmuller Maureen O'Sullivan Tarzan series wasn't remembered for its plot about ivory hunters. It was remembered for how far it pushed the envelope before the production code slammed shut. The movie features one of the most famous pre-code sequences ever filmed, an underwater swimming scene where Tarzan and Jane move through the water in perfect harmony. What made it explosive was Jane's appearance. Maureen O'Sullivan's character was shown in a body-hugging outfit, with certain shots daringly close for the era. In fact, a body double was used for parts of the sequence, and the result sent shockwaves through Hollywood. But the boldness wasn't just visual. The relationship between Tarzan and Jane was presented as natural, intimate, and affectionate, in ways rarely shown on screen at the time. They weren't a married couple bound by society. They were two people in love, living by their own rules in the jungle. For conservative audiences, that freedom was almost scandalous. The movie also leaned into intense action for its era. There were brutal fight scenes, bloody confrontations with animals, and a level of danger that felt far more raw than the safe studio adventures that usually came out of MGM. After its release, Tarzan and His Mate became one of the movies cited by moral crusaders demanding stricter censorship. By the time the production code was fully enforced later that year, scenes like Jane's underwater swim would become impossible to film. That's why Tarzan and His Mate still feels bold. It's a snapshot of Hollywood's wild side just before the curtain of censorship came crashing down. For 1934, this wasn't just a jungle adventure, it was a scandal dressed up as an action epic. Red-Headed Woman, 1932. Jean Harlow was Hollywood's blonde bombshell, but in Red-Headed Woman, she turned her hair fiery and her character even hotter. Released in 1932, this pre-code gem wasn't about playing nice. Harlow stars as Lil Andrews, a woman from the wrong side of town who decides she's going to get rich and doesn't care how. Her method? Pursuing wealthy, married men with a brazenness that made censors foam at the mouth. Lil doesn't apologize for her ambition. She doesn't cry when things go wrong. She simply moves on to the next opportunity. For Depression-era audiences who were used to women being portrayed as victims or moral guardians, this was nothing short of scandalous. A female character who laughed, schemed, and openly enjoyed breaking the rules. That was dynamite. The dialogue crackles with sharp, witty one-liners, delivered with Harlow's trademark smirk. The film was peppered with scenes so daring that even in 1932, some critics called it immoral. But audiences couldn't get enough of her. She wasn't playing a damsel. She was the architect of her own story. The boldness of Red-Headed Woman lies in its refusal to punish Lil. Most pre-code films, if they featured daring women, usually ended with a comeuppance. But here, Harlow struts through the chaos and still manages to win. It was almost a middle finger to the moralists who demanded tidy lessons. Jean Harlow's performance made her a star, and the movie remains a glittering example of the pre-code era's wild freedom. For 1932, it was practically scandal in motion. And that's why it's still remembered as one of the boldest films Hollywood ever dared to make. Hell's Angels, 1930. When Howard Hughes set out to make Hell's Angels, he didn't want to make just another war movie. He wanted the biggest, loudest, most jaw-dropping spectacle Hollywood had ever seen. And in 1930, he got it, by practically inventing modern aerial filmmaking. Hell's Angels tells the story of two brothers caught in World War I, one brave, the other reluctant. But let's be honest, nobody bought a ticket for the melodrama. They came for the skies. Hughes spent millions building planes, hiring pilots, and shooting real dogfights above California. The footage is breathtaking even today, with barrel rolls, mid-air collisions, and smoke-filled battlefields captured in stunning detail. But the boldness didn't stop at the stunts. Hell's Angels also introduced audiences to Jean Harlow in one of her earliest starring roles. Her sultry presence and sly dialogue added a layer of daring that balanced the technical fireworks. Lines like, "Would you be shocked if I put on something more comfortable?" didn't just push boundaries, they shattered them. The production was infamous. Pilots risked their lives for Hughes' vision, and at least one died during filming. Hughes himself nearly crashed while flying a stunt plane. The budget ballooned to unheard-of levels, and the studio bosses thought Hughes had lost his mind. But when the movie premiered, audiences were floored. Hell's Angels was bold because it wasn't safe. Not in its story, not in its production, and certainly not in its attitude. Hughes risked everything to create a spectacle no one else dared attempt. Nearly a century later, those aerial scenes still look thrillingly real. For 1930, this wasn't just a movie. It was Hollywood strapping itself into a cockpit and gunning the engine. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, 1931. Long before CGI monsters or elaborate prosthetics, Frederick March terrified audiences by becoming two men in one body. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde wasn't the first adaptation of Robert Louis Stevenson's story, but it was the boldest. Directed by Ruben Mamoulian, the 1931 version didn't just rely on atmosphere, it used groundbreaking camera, tricks, and makeup to make the transformation horrifyingly real. Frederick March plays Jekyll as a respected doctor who experiments with unlocking the darker impulses of humanity. His alter ego, Hyde, isn't just a monster with shaggy hair and crooked teeth. He's the unfiltered embodiment of temptation, rage, and cruelty. Watching Jekyll morph into Hyde, audiences at the time weren't just entertained, they were unsettled. The makeup effects, combined with clever filters and lighting, made the transformation happen before their eyes without a cut. People in 1931 had never seen anything like it. But the boldness wasn't just visual. The movie delved into territory that was unusually adult for its time. Jekyll's experiments weren't simply scientific, they tapped into questions of morality and desire. Hyde's behavior exposed the animalistic side of humanity, and that honesty rattled audiences. Frederick March's performance was so daring that it earned him an Academy Award for Best Actor, proving that even shocking material could win Hollywood's highest prize. The film pushed the limits of what horror could be. It wasn't just about monsters from outside, it was about the monster lurking inside everyone. That psychological edge was bold, even dangerous, for an audience that preferred clean heroes and tidy morals. By the time the production code clamped down a few years later, films like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde were already seen as too raw for mainstream tastes. But that's what made it unforgettable. It wasn't just a horror story, it was a chilling reminder that the scariest villain might be the one living inside us all. The Public Enemy, 1931. If gangster films needed a poster boy for swagger and menace, James Cagney provided it in The Public Enemy. Released in 1931, this film became the template for every mobster movie that followed. It was raw, gritty, and most of all, bold enough to show crime not as a shadowy background, but as a lifestyle. Cagney plays Tom Powers, a street-smart kid who rises to power during Prohibition by bootlegging and strong-arming his way through Chicago's underworld. From the very first frame, the movie oozes attitude, but it was one infamous breakfast scene that made jaws drop. Tom, annoyed by his girlfriend's complaints, smashes a grapefruit into her face. That single shocking moment captured just how unpredictable and dangerous he was. The violence throughout the movie was unlike anything most audiences had seen. Shootouts, gang rivalries, and cold-blooded murders played out with an intensity that forced viewers to confront the reality of organized crime. And Cagney's performance? Pure electricity. He was fast-talking, cocky, and dangerously charming, the kind of anti-hero who felt more alive than the clean-cut Hollywood leads of the time. Censors panicked. They demanded moral lessons be tacked on, with intertitles and speeches warning against the glamorization of gangsters. But the damage was done. Audiences were already hooked. They didn't just watch Tom Powers, they lived through him for 83 minutes. The boldness of the Public Enemy wasn't only its violence, it was its honesty. It reflected a society in which prohibition had made crime profitable and ordinary people were often powerless. That raw reflection of American life made it stand out, even if the censors hated it. Nearly a century later, the grapefruit scene still gets replayed as a pop culture moment. But the real legacy of The Public Enemy is how it made audiences realize crime stories could be just as compelling and just as bold as any traditional drama. I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, 1932. In 1932, Warner Bros. Dropped a cinematic bombshell with I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang. Unlike most movies of the time, this wasn't just entertainment. It was a direct attack on a brutal American institution. Loosely based on the true story of Robert E. Burns, the film exposed the horrors of the Southern prison labor system, where men were shackled together and worked under inhumane conditions. Paul Mooney stars as James Allen, a decorated World War I veteran who comes home hoping to build a better life. Instead, a twist of fate lands him on a chain gang, where he endures beatings, backbreaking labor, and a system designed to crush the human spirit. For audiences in the early 30s, this wasn't just a story, it was a nightmare that felt all too real. The movie's boldness lies in its unflinching honesty. It showed the dirt, the sweat, the iron shackles. It made no attempt to soften the brutality. Southern states were furious. Prison officials demanded it be banned. But Warner Brothers stood by it, and audiences responded. The film became both a critical and commercial hit, proving people wanted the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. What sealed its place in history was the ending. Unlike the neatly wrapped-up morals demanded by the censors, this movie ended with Allen as a broken fugitive, hiding in the shadows. When asked how he survives, his chilling answer, "I steal," echoed like a gunshot. It was one of the bleakest, boldest endings ever put on film at that time. The impact was massive. Public outcry after the film's release helped spark real prison reforms. That's how powerful it was. I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang proved cinema could do more than entertain. It could expose injustice and force a nation to look in the mirror. Blonde Venus, 1932. When it comes to bold star power, few could match Marlene Dietrich, and Blonde Venus gave her one of her most daring showcases. Directed by Josef von Sternberg, this 1932 pre-code drama mixed sultry nightclub numbers with scandalous storylines, giving audiences a double punch of glamour and controversy. Dietrich plays Helen Faraday, a wife and mother who returns to the stage to help pay for her husband's medical treatment. What begins as sacrifice soon turns into independence as she's swept into a complicated affair with a wealthy man played by Cary Grant in one of his earliest roles. That's right, before he became the smooth Hollywood icon, Grant was playing opposite Dietrich's magnetic force. But the real shock came from the performance scenes. In one of the boldest sequences of the early 1930s, Dietrich emerges on stage dressed in a gorilla suit before peeling it off to reveal a sparkling costume underneath. For audiences in 1932, it was jaw-dropping. It wasn't just suggestive, it was wild, weird, and unforgettable. The storyline didn't play safe either. Helen wasn't portrayed as a simple housewife or moral example. She was complicated, flawed, and unafraid to follow her own path. That defiance unsettled critics, who called the movie immoral, but it electrified audiences who had never seen a woman like this on screen. Blonde Venus was bold because it dared to show a female character navigating desire, survival, and power on her own terms. It gave Dietrich the freedom to mix seduction with strength in a way that felt revolutionary for its time. The movie wasn't just another melodrama, it was a showcase of how cinema could push buttons while dazzling the eye. Even today, the gorilla suit scene alone is enough to remind you. This film wasn't playing by anyone's rules. She Done Him Wrong, 1933. If you ever needed proof that one woman could carry an entire studio on her back, look no further than She Done Him Wrong. Mae West was already a Broadway sensation, known for her quick wit and cheeky wordplay. But when she hit Hollywood, she kicked the doors down. This film introduced audiences to Lady Lou, a saloon singer who commands every room she enters. Men fall over themselves for her, and she doesn't waste a single second pretending she's not in control. The dialogue in this film became legendary. Her line, "Why don't you come up sometime and see me?" practically burned into pop culture and was repeated for decades. It was delivered with a smirk that told audiences she knew exactly what she was saying. West's ability to push boundaries without ever being explicit was what made her a master. She could say something outrageous, but make it sound like a joke, and audiences loved her for it. The boldness of She Done Him Wrong wasn't just in West's sass, it was in what it represented. At a time when women were usually written as docile love interests or moral examples, West played a character who was unapologetically in charge of her destiny. She flirted, she schemed, and she made no apologies for enjoying life on her terms. Critics thought it was indecent. Audiences thought it was genius. The film was such a smash hit that it single-handedly saved Paramount Pictures from financial collapse. That's how powerful Mae West was. She wasn't just bold for 1933, she was decades ahead of her time. Watching her today, you can still feel the swagger. Mae West didn't just play Lady Lou, she owned her. And in doing so, she owned the screen. Imitation of Life 1934. When audiences walked into Imitation of Life in 1934, they were expecting a typical melodrama. What they got instead was one of the most daring explorations of race, class, and motherhood ever attempted in classic Hollywood. The story follows two women, Claudette Colbert as Bay Pullman, a struggling widow, and Louise Beavers as Delilah Johnson, a black mother raising her daughter. They join forces, starting a pancake business that makes them wealthy. But beneath the success lies a story that Hollywood rarely touched: the crushing realities of racial identity and prejudice. The boldest storyline revolves around Delilah's daughter, Peola, who is light-skinned enough to pass as white. Her rejection of her heritage and her desperate attempts to blend into white society created waves of controversy. This was decades before the Civil Rights Movement, and the idea of showing such raw conflict on screen was nearly unheard of. It wasn't a side plot, it was the heart of the film. Louise Beavers gave one of the most powerful performances of her career, breaking through Hollywood's stereotypes of black women as one-dimensional characters. Claudette Colbert added balance with her portrayal of a woman navigating independence and success. Together, their partnership carried a weight audiences couldn't ignore. The film was a box office success, but its daring themes stuck with audiences long after the credits rolled. It wasn't perfect. Hollywood still framed the story through the lens of white respectability. But for 1934, it was a revolution. It dared to ask questions about race and belonging in a society that refused to answer them. Bold? Absolutely. Nearly a century later, the raw emotion of Imitation of Life still feels uncomfortably real. Of Human Bondage, 1934. Before. Of Human Bondage, Bette Davis was just another contract player waiting for her big break. After it, she became a force of nature. Playing Mildred, a cold-hearted waitress who manipulates and humiliates a man hopelessly in love with her, Davis turned in one of the most brutally honest performances ever seen in the 1930s. There was nothing glamorous about it. She was shrill, cruel, and pitiless. And that's exactly what made it unforgettable. Audiences had never seen a leading woman act like this before. Instead of charm or grace, Davis gave them venom and disdain. When her character finally falls ill later in the film, Davis stripped away vanity even further, allowing herself to look disheveled and weak in a way actresses of the time almost never dared. It wasn't just a role, it was a full-body transformation, the kind that made critics sit up straight and take notice. Based on Somerset Maugham's novel, the film itself was daring for exploring obsession and degradation. The central relationship between Philip, the idealistic medical student, and Mildred, the manipulative waitress, was messy, toxic, and painfully believable. This wasn't a love story. It was a lesson in how love can destroy people when it curdles into obsession. The boldness of Human Bondage lies in how unflinching it is. There's no tidy, happy ending. no attempt to soften the characters. It showed audiences that movies could portray people at their ugliest and still be art. Warner Brothers soon signed Davis to a long-term deal after her performance here, and the rest is history. If Babyface proved women could be ambitious, Of Human Bondage proved they could be terrifying, and audiences loved every second. Jezebel, 1938. When Bette Davis took on Jezebel, she wasn't just playing another period drama role, she was redefining what it meant to be a leading lady in the late 1930s. Her character, Julie Marsden, is a headstrong Southern belle who doesn't just bend social rules, she tramples them. The most famous scene comes when she scandalizes New Orleans society by wearing a fiery red dress to a ball where unmarried women were expected to wear white. That moment wasn't just bold for the character, it was bold for cinema itself. The drama between Julie and her fiancé Preston, played by Henry Fonda, digs deep into pride, rebellion, and the cost of arrogance. Davis plays Julie as a woman who won't conform, even when it destroys her relationships. She's fiery, defiant, and magnetic to watch. Audiences couldn't look away, even when they knew disaster was inevitable. What made Jezebel especially daring was its portrayal of a woman as deeply flawed, yet compelling. Hollywood often punished independent women by making them villains, but Davis brought so much nuance that Julie felt human. Her rebellion was her strength, and her downfall. That complexity earned Davis her second Academy Award. The movie itself pushed the boundaries of how female characters were written in studio dramas. Instead of being ornamental, Julie drove the entire story. She wasn't just part of the drama, she was the drama. For 1938, that was revolutionary. Jezebel proved that audiences were ready to see women who weren't always likable, but were always unforgettable. It was a turning point for Davis and for Hollywood, showing that bold characters could make bold films into timeless classics. Gone with the Wind, 1939. Few films have ever loomed as large as Gone with the Wind. From its nearly 4-hour runtime to its sweeping Technicolor landscapes, this wasn't just a movie, it was an event. Premiering in 1939, it became the highest-grossing film of its era and remains one of the most talked-about productions in Hollywood history. But what makes it bold isn't just the scale, it's the audacity of everything about it. At its center is Vivien Leigh's Scarlett O'Hara, one of cinema's most unapologetically ambitious heroines. Scarlett lies, schemes, manipulates, and survives in a world torn apart by war and Reconstruction. Audiences in 1939 had never seen a female character written with that much grit and fire. Clark Gable's Rhett Butler was the perfect counterpoint. Charming, cynical, and every bit as calculating. Together, they made sparks fly in a way that felt dangerously real. The production itself was bold to the point of reckless. Multiple directors were hired and fired, sets were burned down for spectacle, and the budget ballooned into a then astronomical sum. Every frame screamed risk, and yet every frame also screamed ambition. Of course, the film's legacy is complicated. Its portrayal of slavery in the Old South has sparked heated debate for decades. But whether praised or criticized, it forced audiences to reckon with America's past in ways no other mainstream film dared attempt at the time. For 1939, Gone with the Wind was the definition of bold. It didn't just tell a story, it built a cinematic empire. Love it or hate it, you can't ignore it. And that's exactly what makes it one of the most daring films ever made before the 1940s. So, there you have it, 15 films that proved Hollywood wasn't always safe, sanitized, or predictable. Before the censors locked everything down, these movies pushed boundaries, shocked audiences, and rewrote the rules of what cinema could be. Which one do you think was the boldest? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untamed Hollywood history. Because if these films taught us anything, it's this: boldness never fades.